arguments that I'm like working through and where I'm at so far and where I see things going. So basically any input, questions or anything like that, feel free because they're all valuable to me in this in the place where I'm at with this. So I see at the round table, engaging with Elden Ring to explore queer theories, social, antisocial divides. And just to start off, I would like to look just overall at what my aims of my research are. So I'm interested in understandings of queer identity in or with video games and how digitally entangled experiences of queerness in the Gothic may challenge or even disrupt queer community boundaries or even a perceived lack thereof. My theoretical approaches come from posthumanism, queer theory, and Gothic literature through virtue of looking at the Soulsborne genre. My methodological approaches as well come from posthumanism and specifically looking at reflexive or narrative autoethnographies. I'm currently also trying to work through the difference between posthumanism as a philosophical versus methodological approach, which may come out through this, but I will keep going anyway. If there's any questions, let me know. My key questions for this are: how is queerness experienced in or with video games? How do Gothic digital spaces frame queerness or queer experiences and their analysis? And how are digitally entangled experiences of queerness different to others? What are the potential boundaries of such experiences, and how do they support or challenge wider community boundaries? For the purposes of this presentation, I'll just be concentrating on theoretical approaches and key questions, as the methodological questions I thought would be too much for what I'm going to talk about here. So just as a brief note, I think it's worth mentioning Poppy's work, as has been before, as well as talking about Karen Barad's work on entanglements. So just to be clear on the terms that I'm going to be using, when I talk about performativity, I mean it in a post-human notion, and with it being an analytics of power that moves beyond the materiality of the body. And then with Barad's work, where it moves from Schrodinger and entanglements, the idea that the subject changes state, there's no possible resolution that can possibly leave either party in the same state of being as they were before. I believe that this has potential implications for how queerness may also be considered. Post-human hybrids, I am talking about the physical and the technological. And Halberstam and Irigare put forward that creative post-human hybrids, the post-human does not necessitate the obsolescence of the human. It does not represent an evolution or devolution of the human. Rather, it participates in redistribution of difference and identity. And then finally, to reference Patricia McCormick, she talks about creative post-human hybrids resisting narrativization in two ways. They exist as multi-connective nodes, and what is emphasized is the nodes of connection between entities. And this is contrasted with looking at them as separate, but having some sort of relationship together. And that these creative hybrids do not know their own futures, and thus cannot speak to preserve or extend their present, nor sacrifice other entities in order to affirm their current form of identity. At any one time, the self is or can be sacrificed. And I think also important to note here is that McCormick argues that a sacrifice of the self is not a death sacrifice, which can be understood through acts of reproduction, either of the self or of the other. Instead, a post-human sacrifice here can be perceived as queer in that it does not or cannot even map to reproductive acts. As a result of this, and I don't want to get into this here, but I do think it's worth noting, I do wonder about whether we should think about death or sacrifice of a perceived self in the video games. For the sake of clarity, though, I will be sticking with using death because I think it will just get very confusing otherwise. Okay, so what I want to focus on with queer theory is the social-antisocial divide. So antisocial or anti-relational, as it's known, coming from the work of Leo Bersani and Edelman, it positions abjection as the hallmark of specifically gay male subjectivity rather than necessarily queer subjectivity, and that is a critique against it. Lacanian psychoanalysis and death-driven jouissance are the key ideas within it, and it really stems from the AIDS epidemic in particular, and with Bersani writing a key essay, Is the Rectum a Grave? The idea is that you are embracing subordination, hope is a delusion, and queerness can only be perceived as resistance. In contrast to this, Munoz, as well as other theorists, including Halberstam, write that sexuality is a contingent category, and it prioritizes pleasure, desire, and hope. It seeks to acknowledge community and stand against any notion of the radical that merely connotes some notion of extremity, righteousness, or affirmation of newness. Linked to this is Giorgio Gambon's work on potentiality and actuality, and the idea that you can possess faculty or the capacity to not do or do. And overall, Munoz presents queerness as utopian, and talks about the idea of queer futurity, and he talks as hope, while Edelman criticizes it as being delusional. Munoz maintains that it is a necessary risk, and that it is a challenge directly to the concept of straight time. With these two, what I wonder about then when it comes to looking at games like Elden Ring, is that when interacting with queer physicality through the player, these games bring into question the conceptualization of queerness. And just a couple of questions that I have in relation to this. Is queerness understood as resistance or as a community whose borders are defined via non-normative desires? What consequences does this have for who is included or excluded? And can such considerations be given without undermining community struggles, which I think is a really important point that I'm trying to suss out at the moment. To move to Elden Ring specifically then, and how I want to examine queerness through it as a lens. Elden Ring, as an overview, is an action role-playing game, RPG, developed by From Software in collaboration with the novelist George R.R. Martin, consisting of both combat and open-world exploration. It is considered to be part of the Soulsborne series or genre of games released by the studio, portmanteau of Dark Souls and Bloodborne, two of the studio's other titles. It follows in the pattern of both design and playstyle. In short, they are challenging third-person action games that rely on stamina-based combat, experience points that are lost upon death, and a loose narrative structure that leaves it up to the player to unravel its mysteries. They also tend to be set in bleak, unforgiving worlds, although the specific setting can vary drastically between each entry. Soulsborne is not necessarily an agreed-on term, but it is one that, for the purposes of what I'm trying to discuss, is useful in that it serves to catalogue Elden Ring with other titles in From Software. Plot summary, just to have an overview of it. Slight spoilers, I suppose. A human woman named Marika was elevated to the status of God Queen by a distant and unknowable cosmic entity, and then continually undermined the world in increasingly awful ways. You are the chosen tarnished, the potential right hand of Marika, who journeys through the lands between, facing demigods, while trying to understand the machinations of cosmic forces beyond your control. As you progress through the game, your job is to reassemble the Elden Ring by collecting runes of it from various demigods. Crucial to this is the near immortality of these gods up to this point. In the game, with the rune of death, or what's also referred to in the game as Destined Death, having been removed by Marika from the Elden Ring sometime previous. Death has not operated as it should have, and there may come a point where you need to fix that. I think that might be a slight spoiler warning. That is exactly what you do. The TLD orbital, the lands between, need a new regional manager. You are applying for the job, is the basics of it. So to bring in what I want to argue, looking at player avatar entanglements and NPCs, for instance, Elden Ring brings into question the lines of division between the presented, non-playable characters, NPCs, and your own character. NPCs only occupy the digital environment, lacking an aspect of physical embodiment which your avatar has. The player, an identified part of the player avatar entanglement, is thus positioned as the difference between the success and failure of the avatar you control. Physical entanglement is a central aspect of the game's progression, and the lines between the agency of the player and the avatar are blurred, neither existing without the other. Both become embedded in a multi-relational self. To think about death, then, in these games. Near the beginning of Elden Ring, you are sent to a location called the Round Table Hold when you first die. Here, various NPCs are introduced that play a similar narrative role to your own character, you all being part of the collective tarnished who may become the Elden Lord. Whether through a lack of skill or will, many of these characters are presented as having given up on the quest that you are about to embark on. The game arguably tells you as a player then that the only reason you will not succeed is through your own shortcomings. You are the difference now between the success or failure of your character. Other avatars didn't have you. The boundaries between the player and the avatar are thus blurred. Thus, the player avatar is engaging with death in ways that not only determine how the game is experienced, but also how the digital environment is. Death in the digital environment is a meaningful aspect of the entangled subject. Following on from that then, because of this positioning of death, and this is how I would see the social antisocial divide between queerness being problematized. Edelman's argument puts forward that specifically gay men need to accept their subjugated status within society and embrace their own self-undoing. In Is the Rectum a Grave, Bersani argues that this could include actions such as embracing death at the height of the AIDS crisis, for instance. AIDS has literalized that potential for death as the certainty of biological death, and has therefore reinforced the heterosexual association of anal sex with self-annihilation. It may, finally, be in the gay man's rectum that he demolishes his own perhaps otherwise uncontrollable identification with a murderous judgment against him. However, I propose that the reformulation of death in Elden Ring and the games within the Soulsborne genre more generally have the capacity to challenge such an approach to queerness, problematizing the divide between anti-relational and relational approaches. Although death may appear to mark an end in the entanglement between player and avatar, the process of birth or rebirth reconstitutes this entanglement and symbolizes a moment of epistemological change, a moment of reflection on previous actions that thus offer new possibilities. This could be further linked with McCormick's conception of sacrificing the post-human self, as was mentioned previously. However, the queer post-human subject here also considers relational queer embodiment, while having the potential to engage with death-driven jouissance, or a reformulation of it. I therefore argue that when considered as entanglement with queer embodiment, death in Elden Ring is itself queer, in line with Edelman's death-driven jouissance, but within the context of Munoz's queer futurity. The queer body is understood within the context of community, but is able to enact queer resistance in a digital space. My conclusion to all of this is that I posit that there are forms of queerness that cannot be separated from the digital. What I want to find out is where the boundaries of such a queerness or queernesses lie. How do they differ from other forms of queerness that aren't necessarily technologically mediated? What do they reveal about what is or isn't, or even who is or isn't queer? What norms are potentially maintained or even created? I am interested in those who identify as part of the queer or LGBTQ+ community and how their understanding or understandings of queerness are supported or challenged through interacting with Elden Ring and other Soulsborne games. The Gothic, specifically games that align with the Soulsborne genre, can expose the boundaries of digitally mediated queerness, really revealing what it is and what it is not within a Western context. This is possible through the positioning of death, which facilitates the problematization of the social antisocial divide. Such research will require an examination of the potentiality of queerness in or with the digital, examining not only the potentiality associated with doing queerness, but also the potentiality to not do it. And my bibliography, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Greg. I absolutely loved it. It was brilliant.